The July night rain relentlessly drummed against the tin roof. I sat lost in thought under the dim yellow light of the living room, taking a sip of strong whiskey, flipping through the unfinished pages of a book. The quietness of a single man is sometimes a privilege until a knock on the door echoed hesitant, yet urgent. I set my glass down, frowning slightly. It was 11 o'clock at night when the wooden door opened, cold wind and rain lashed at my face. Standing there was Clara, the neighbor who had moved in a few months ago with her young son. She was drenched, her hair clinging to her pale cheeks from the cold. Her eyes carried a look of helplessness and panic. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry to bother you at this hour." Clara's voice trembled, her teeth chattering. "My car broke down in the middle of the road, my boy. Leo is sleeping in the back seat and I didn't know who else to call." I didn't ask a single question. I knew how hard the life of a single mother was, and for her to knock on a stranger's door in the middle of the night meant she was at the end of her rope. Turned back inside, grabbed my leather jacket, picked up my heavy toolbox and tossed her a towel. "Dry off. Get in the truck, I'll take you out there," I said in a low voice. My truck tore through the rain. When we arrived, Clara's beat-up sedan sat stranded on the dark shoulder of the road. I scooped up the sleeping Leo and moved him to the warm back seat of my truck, letting Clara sit beside him. Then, pulling my hood up, I braved the storm alone, hooking up the tow cable to her car's undercarriage. From inside the warm cabin, through the rain-streaked windshield, I could see Clara watching me. It was a complex gaze filled with guilt, embarrassment, and a reliance she probably hadn't felt in a very long time. I towed the broken car back to my garage. That night I gave the mother and son my living room to rest, while I crawled under the car beneath the dim neon lights. The smell of grease and exhaust mixed with the scent of damp earth. Around 3 in the morning, I heard soft footsteps. Clara stepped out, holding a steaming mug of coffee. She was wearing the oversized flannel shirt I had given her earlier, looking smaller and more fragile than ever. She crouched down next to me, hesitantly offering the mug. "You don't have to stay up all night for us." I slid out for car and took the mug. Her hand lightly brushed mine. It was ice cold. She leaned in, using the sleeve of her shirt to gently wipe away a smear of black grease on my forehead. That natural, caring gesture made my heart skip a beat. The world around us seemed to stand still, leaving only the sound of the rain outside. I always feel like a burden. Clara lowered her eyes, her voice choking up. A single mom with a mess of problems, a rundown car, and an inability to handle her own life. I set the coffee down and looked straight into her teary eyes. I wasn't a man good with sweet words. I simply turned back, tightened the last bolt, and turned the ignition. The engine roared to life, shattering the silence and entirely dismantling the insecurity that was suffocating her. "It's fixed," I said simply. The next morning the rain had completely stopped. The first rays of sunlight pierced through the garage's rolling door. I had fallen asleep exhausted on the old sofa next to my tool cabinet. A faint sweet scent and a gentle warmth woke me up. Clara was sitting right next to me, carefully draping a thin blanket over my shoulders. When she saw me open my eyes, she smiled. It was the most radiant and peaceful smile I had ever seen. "Since he left, no one has ever done this for me," Clara whispered, her voice as delicate as morning dew, subtly shifting the way she spoke to me. Her eyes held a deep, emotional flutter. "I wish I had found you first." I sat up, holding her gaze. My rough hand reached up, gently tucking a stray lock of hair behind her ear. "It doesn't matter when you found me," I replied in my deepest, steadiest voice. "What matters is, from now on, you'll never have to fix a car by yourself in the rain again." Clara nodded slightly, a single tear of happiness rolling down her cheek. The door to the living room swung open and a sleepy Leo came running out, throwing his arms around my legs. I lifted the boy into the air, his contagious laughter echoing through the room. Clara looked at the two of us, her eyes brimming with love. Last night's storm had washed away all the loneliness, leaving behind a new, peaceful, and warm beginning. In the days following that stormy night, something quietly changed between us, an unspoken bond. Clara was no longer the timid neighbor trying to hide her exhaustion behind a forced smile. My truck and her old sedan were now often parked side by side in the shared driveway, a silent affirmation that she was no longer alone. Leo started coming over to my place more often. The boy seemed to view my grease-stained garage as a wonderland. I bought a set of plastic tools, and every afternoon after work I would teach him how to pretend to drive screws into scrap pieces of wood. From her porch next door, Clara would often stand leaning against the doorway, watching us with a steaming mug of tea in her hands. Her eyes no longer held fear or defensiveness. They were filled with a heartbreaking tenderness. But the life of a single mother never gets easier overnight just because a storm has passed. About 2 weeks later, as I was organizing my wrenches, I heard an argument echoing from Clara's house. A man's voice rang out harsh and full of malice. I dropped my tools and took long strides across the lawn. Standing on her front porch was Mark, Clara's ex-husband. He reeked of alcohol, pointing fingers and yelling at her about child support, while Clara stood blocking the doorway, clutching Leo tightly to her chest, her shoulders shaking violently. Without a word, I stepped up onto the porch and wedged myself between them. I was a full head taller than him. My presence carried a coldness capable of suffocating any bully. "Who the hell are you?" Mark growled, but he took a step back, his eyes flashing with clear apprehension. I shoved my hands into my pockets, looking him in the eye with icy composure. "I'm the guy who's going to throw you off this lawn if you don't disappear in the next 3 seconds. The man opened his mouth to curse, but seeing my jaw clench and the utter lack of amusement in my eyes, he swallowed hard, muttered a few curses, turned on his heel, and hurried back to his car, peeling out and speeding away. Silence returned, leaving only Clara's heavy breathing. I turned around. She had collapsed onto the steps, burying her face in her hands and sobbing uncontrollably. The borrowed strength she had tried to maintain all this time had completely shattered. I sat down next to her, wrapping an arm around her trembling shoulders and pulling her into my chest. Clara didn't resist. She buried her face in my shirt, gripping the fabric like a drowning person clinging to a lifeline. The earthy scent of jasmine in her hair mixed with the smell of sweat and sawdust on my clothes. "I'm so tired," Clara sobbed, her voice breaking. "I've tried so hard to be strong, but I'm exhausted. I'm terrified every time the sun goes down. I'm afraid I won't be able to give Leo a good life." I let her cry until her tears began to run dry. I gently stroked her messy hair, my rough hands trying to be as tender as possible. People out there or romance novels might talk about sweeping declarations of love, but for a dry man like me, love was never about the words. "Then stop being strong," I whispered, lifting her chin so those red, tear-filled eyes had to look directly at me. "You've been carrying this alone for too long, Clara. From this moment on, let me be your shield." Clara stared at me, stunned. Her lips parted, trembling before a soft smile broke through her tears. She leaned in and our lips met. It wasn't rushed or desperate. It was a kiss of profound connection, of warmth chasing away the cold that had haunted her for years. My heavy heart, the one I thought would remain hardened and solitary for the rest of my life, was now beating with immense strength. I tightened my embrace around her and her son under the fading sunset. Storms might come again, her ex-husband might return to cause trouble, but my garage was no longer the hideout of a lonely bachelor. It had become a home, and I knew I would protect this home at all costs. That kiss under the sunset changed everything. There were no loud confessions or empty promises. We simply stepped into each other's lives in the most natural way possible, as if two puzzle pieces had finally found their place after years of being lost. For the next few weeks, my garage was no longer just the domain of a solitary man. It became Leo's afternoon pit stop, and my front porch became the place where Clara sat knitting, smiling as she watched me work beneath the cars. Still, I knew the ghosts of her past hadn't let her go. The restless nights, waking up in a cold sweat, the nervous glances out the window whenever a loud engine roared down the street. Clara was still living on edge. Her ex-husband's appearance the other day was like a crack in the glass wall she had worked so hard to build. One Saturday morning, I decided to carry my toolbox over to her house. The wooden steps on Clara's front porch had rotted away long ago, creaking dangerously with every step. Her ex-husband had never cared to fix them, and Clara didn't have the strength. I rolled up my sleeves and started using a crowbar to pry the rotted boards loose. Leo ran around energetically, clutching the plastic hammer I had bought him, occasionally tapping the air to help the carpenter. The morning sun beat down, making the sweat on my forehead glisten. The smell of sawdust and fresh pine filled the small yard. By noon, Clara stepped out with a tray of iced lemonade. She was wearing a simple floral dress, her hair pinned up with a few loose strands falling against her neck. She sat down on the concrete steps, quietly watching me measure and cut the new boards. "You know," Clara suddenly spoke up, her voice so soft it was as if she were talking to herself. "Mark used to tell me I was useless, that without him Leo and I wouldn't survive a month. He let everything in this house rot just to prove that I always needed to beg him for help." I stopped sawing, brushed the sawdust off my jeans, and walked over beside her. I took the glass of ice-cold lemonade, took a long swig, and looked straight into Clara's eyes. "Weak man uses fear to tie down his woman because he knows he has no other value to make her stay," I said in a low voice. "But look, these rotten boards are gone. This house and your life will only be built on solid ground from now on." Clara leaned over, resting her head on my shoulder. Her warm breath washed over my sweat-soaked t-shirt. In that moment, I silently swore to myself that I would never let anyone break this woman ever again. But trouble usually knocks when people least expect it. A few days later, while I was sleeping on the sofa in Clara's living room, I had decided to crash there a few nights because she mentioned having nightmares. A piercing crash shattered the night. The clock read 2 a.m. Someone had just hurled a shattered beer bottle through the front glass window. Instantly, I sprang up, the honed instincts of a man who had weathered many storms making my muscles tense. From the bedroom, Leo's terrified wails rang out, mingling with Clara's panicked footsteps. "Open the door, you bitch!" Mark's slurred drunken roar came from the porch. He was kicking the wooden door hard, the hinges rattling violently. "You think finding some cheap mechanic means I'm gonna leave you alone?" Clara bolted into the living room, clutching a trembling Leo. Her face was drained of all color. The look she gave me was filled with absolute terror. "Go into the bedroom. Lock the door, call the cops," I ordered in a cold, sharp voice that allowed no hesitation. "No matter what you hear, absolutely do not come out until I call for you." Clara nodded, holding her son tight as she ran back inside. The click of the door lock echoed through the house. I slowly walked toward the front door. The drunk outside was still screaming like a madman, winding up for another kick, when I suddenly yanked the deadbolt back and threw the door wide open. Losing his balance, Mark stumbled forward. Before he could even look up, I grabbed him by the collar of his leather jacket and, using the weight of my entire body, forcefully shoved him backward out onto the porch. His back slammed hard against the green wooden post I had installed just days ago. He groaned in pain, unsteadily pulling a small switchblade from his pocket, his eyes bloodshot and unhinged. "We'll kill you," he lunged. But for a drunk, every movement was like a movie in slow motion. I dodged his sloppy slash, delivering a clean, cold, and decisive punch straight to his jaw. Mark collapsed onto the wooden deck with a heavy thud, the knife clattering away into the grass. I stepped forward, grabbed him by the scruff of his neck, and pressed his face into the floorboards, driving my knee hard into his back, pinning him down effortlessly. "I warned you," I hissed into his ear, gritting out every word. "This is not your house anymore, and the woman inside is no longer your punching bag. From now on, she's mine." 5 minutes later, the wail of police sirens tore through the quiet neighborhood. As they handcuffed Mark and dragged him into the back of the cruiser, I knew Clara's nightmare was finally over. The red and blue lights faded into the distance and disappeared past the intersection. The July night air returned to its usual stillness. I dusted off my hands and walked back inside. The bedroom door creaked open. Clara was sitting on the floor, an exhausted Leo asleep in her arms. Seeing me safe and sound, the tears Clara had been holding back finally broke. She set her son on the bed, ran to me, and threw her arms around me. Her small hands gripped the back of my shirt tightly as she sobbed like a child. I wrapped my arms around her, breathing in her familiar scent, soothing the trembling shoulders. We just stood there holding each other in the middle of a living room littered with broken glass. "I'm sorry," Clara sobbed, looking up at me with tear-filled eyes. "Dragged you into the miserable mess of my life again. A widow, single mom with a chaotic past. No man wants to take on a burden like this." I lifted her face, wiping away the tears streaming down her cheeks. I looked deep into her beautiful eyes, which held so much pain but also an overwhelming resilience. "If no one else wants to take it on," whispered, leaning down to press my forehead against hers, feeling every breath of the woman I knew I would spend the rest of my life protecting. "Then I'll be the first." The next morning, sunlight flooded into the living room through the shattered window, carrying the misty chill of the early dawn. I woke up very early, gently untangling Clara's arms from around my waist so as not to wake her. Last night, after everything settled down, she had fallen asleep exhausted against my chest right on the sofa. Her breathing was steady and more relieved than any night prior. I walked into the living room, grabbed a broom, and carefully swept up every shard of shattered glass scattered across the rug. Once the floor was completely clear of anything that could hurt Leo's bare feet, I went out to the garage and carried in a large piece of plywood. I used a hammer and nails to secure the board over the gaping window frame to block the wind until the glass repairman arrived. Every strike of the hammer landed with a solid thud. It wasn't the violent, destructive noise of the drunk from last night. It was the sound of protection, of healing. "You always know how to fix things, don't you?" A gentle, clear voice rang out from behind me. I stopped hammering and turned around. Clara was leaning against the bedroom door frame, wrapped in a thin blanket against the cold. Her eyes still carried a trace of exhaustion and were slightly puffy from crying, but the constant panic and fear that had plagued her for so long had completely vanished. In its place was a profound peace I hadn't seen in her since the first day she knocked on my door in the storm. I lowered the hammer, slipping one hand into my jeans pocket. "It's just a temporary board. The repairman will bring the new glass this afternoon, and your house will be safe again." Clara took slow steps toward me. Paying no mind to the sawdust or dirt clinging to my shirt, she wrapped her arms around my waist, pressing her cheek against my chest, quietly listening to the strong heartbeat of a man who once thought he'd be forever alone. "It's not just the window," Clara whispered, looking up at me with clear eyes sparkling with the light of newfound hope. "You fixed my whole life. You gave my son and me the very thing I thought I'd never deserve to have again." Just then, the pitter-patter of little feet echoed. Leo, in his messy pajamas, came running out yawning. He dashed straight over and hugged my leg. "Did you fix the house for Mommy?" the boy babbled. I laughed, leaning down to scoop Leo up with one strong arm, while my other arm held Clara close. The morning light poured into the room, illuminating the faces of the three of us. Men of few words like me rarely know how to make grand declarations of eternal love, but the way I held this mother and son tightly in my embrace spoke every promise of forever. The storm had passed, and the ghosts of the past had been banished. Now in this house filled with the scent of fresh wood, my heavy heart had finally found a peaceful harbor. Time quietly passed, bringing the biting cold winds of late autumn sweeping through the neighborhood. It had been 3 months since Clara's ex-husband smashed the living room window. 3 months of no yelling, no panicked tears or fearful cowardice. Only Leo's contagious laughter and the soothing clinking of tools in my garage. Mark had been sentenced to prison for assault and property damage, vanishing from her life. For good, all the ghosts from the past had finally been exorcised. That Saturday morning it was chilly and fog still clung to the bare branches of the trees. I woke up early, brewed a pot of black coffee, and threw on my worn canvas jacket before stepping out into the yard. Between my property and Clara's stood a weather-beaten wooden fence. It had been built years ago to divide the two lots, a physical boundary that strangers used to protect their privacy. But now it was an eyesore. I hauled a sledgehammer out of the garage, swung it back, and delivered a massive blow to the main post. The sound of splintering wood shattered the quiet morning air. I kept swinging, sweat beading on my forehead despite the freezing weather. Rotted planks fell apart and crashed onto the grass. "Are you planning a demolition at 7 in the morning on a weekend?" Clara's sleepy, amused voice drifted over from her porch. I stopped swinging, rested my chin on the hammer's handle, and looked back. She was standing there wrapped in my oversized plaid flannel shirt, her hands warming around a steaming mug of hot chocolate. Brown hair tumbled freely in the morning breeze. She looked so peaceful and radiant that my heart skipped a beat yet again. "This fence is blocking my view," I replied bluntly, shrugging and wiping the sweat from my forehead with the back of my hand. "Besides, Leo runs back and forth all the time, and he could trip over these roots sticking up near the fence. We don't need this boundary anymore." Clara stepped off the porch and strolled toward me. She looked at the yard, now wide open and undivided, merging the two houses into one sprawling lawn. A soft smile graced her lips. Clara wrapped one arm around my waist, resting her head against my aching bicep. The warmth radiating from her body chased away the morning frost. "You always know how to tear down walls, don't you?" she whispered, looking up at me with her hazel eyes. The fence in the yard and the defensive walls around my heart. We leaned down, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead, breathing in her familiar faint scent of jasmine. There was no need for more words because between us, silence and actions were always the deepest language. As the neighborhood sank into winter, I spent most of the late evenings holed up in my garage, not fixing car engines but whittling a small block of beechwood no bigger than the palm of my hand. Leo would often run around curiously, standing on his tiptoes at the workbench, watching me sand every edge of the wood until it was perfectly smooth. "What are you making?" the boy asked, his big round eyes blinking, tapping the edge of the table with his plastic hammer. "Making a new house," I smiled, reaching out to ruffle his hair, feeling the familial bond growing in my heart. "A very special house for your mom." On Christmas Eve that year, snow began to gently fall on the porch roof. The fireplace in my living room crackled with bright red embers, fending off the bitter winter chill outside. Leo had fallen fast asleep on the large armchair after exhausting himself opening presents. Clara sat beside me on the thick sheepskin rug, leaning her slender back against my chest. She quietly watched the flames, her long fingers tracing the calluses on my rough hands, grazing the old scars of a seasoned man. Last year on Christmas Eve, I sat crying alone in the corner of a cramped apartment kitchen. Clara suddenly spoke up, her voice dropping, tinged with the lingering pain of the past. I thought my life was over then, a failure broke, dragging a small child along with nowhere to turn, and then my car breaking down in that July rainstorm turned out to be the greatest miracle of my life. She turned around, resting her arms on my chest, and cupped my face in her soft hands. Her eyes overflowed with a fierce love, a pure affection that a dry man like me never thought he deserved. Thank you for opening the door that night, for towing my car, for fixing the porch, for standing up to Mark. Thank you for saving us. I reached up, gently tucking a stray lock of hair behind her cheek, which was flushed from the heat of the fire. I had never watched cheesy romance movies to learn how to speak flowery words or make grand promises. Men like me only knew how to prove things with our hands and our actions. I reached into my jeans pocket and carefully pulled out the small beechwood box I had meticulously carved and polished for an entire month. I placed it in her small palm. Clara's eyes went wide. She held her breath, her fingers trembling slightly as she slowly flipped open the lid of the wooden box. Inside, resting neatly on jet black velvet, was a simple yet exquisitely crafted silver ring, reflecting the flickering light of the fireplace. There was no flashy giant diamond, only a steady, enduring brilliance that shone as calmly as our love itself. I fixed your old car. I rebuilt the porch, and even replaced that broken window. I cleared my throat, looking directly into her eyes with all the sincerity and resolve I had. I've honestly run out of things to fix at your house, Clara, so figure it's time we stop splitting ourselves between two houses. Tears welled up in Clara's eyes. She cried, but they were tears of an overwhelming, irrepressible happiness. Her lips trembled, unable to form a word. I don't promise to give you a life of extravagant luxury or a fairy tale romance, I continued, my thumb gently wiping away the hot tear that just rolled down her cheek. But I promise that from now on you will never have to face another storm alone. Whatever burdens you carry, let me shoulder them. Will you marry me? Clara didn't answer right away, sobbing. She threw herself into my arms, wrapping her arms tightly around my neck and burying her face in the crook of my shoulder. She nodded, repeatedly, the strongest, most determined, and most choked-up nod I had ever felt. I gently lifted her hand, sliding the silver ring onto her ring finger. It would fit perfectly, just like the way we had stepped into each other's lives and pieced together the broken fragments. Clara looked up, pulled my collar down, and we shared a deep, slow, and passionate kiss. Outside the window, snow to my blank in pure white, covering Ebron, the wide-open lawn where a boundary fence no longer stood. They say men of few words always carry a heavy heart, but tonight the solitary man with the scarred heart was completely gone. In my arms right now was my family, my future. Finally, the cold garage of my soul had been filled with the warmth of true love. My heart had never felt so light and peaceful.